On the 6th of April, 1984, a third-floor apartment in East Berlin woke to water tapping the linoleum. The brown ring above the kitchen light would later force open the ceiling. The drip had no source. In the case notes, a warped ceiling tile would later unravel what the plumbing had been hiding. The tenant slid a saucepan under the stain and went to work. By evening, the pan was full, and the ceiling felt soft when a fingertip pressed it. The building's superintendent arrived with a canvas tool bag and a ring of keys that clinked against the stair rail. He expected a split joint. That was routine in a block this old. But when he opened the service closet, the shutoff valve was already chalk-marked, as if someone had been there first. He cut water to the line and climbed a stepladder. The stain was circular, too clean at the edges. When he pried the tile down, it resisted like it was glued. A strip of fresh sealant ran along one corner newer than everything around it. Behind the tile sat a thin metal tray, not part of the ceiling grid. It held the leak away from the plaster, directing it into a plastic tube that disappeared into the wall. No one in the building had asked for that kind of repair. The superintendent didn't call the plumber he usually used. He called the housing office because the closet keys and the chalk mark didn't feel accidental. The next morning, two men arrived with clipboards, not wrenches, and asked for the maintenance ledger. They didn't say what they were looking for. They only asked who signed out the keys on Wednesdays and why a work order from the phone company had been filed under pipes. In the hallway, the saucepan kept catching drips steady as a metronome. By the end of the week, the apartment was quiet in a different way. The ceiling tile was back in place, but the metal tray was gone. The service closet logbook had a page torn out. And a neighbor across the landing mentioned that someone had been testing the lines late the previous month, carrying a small brown case and leaving without turning on a light. When the superintendent lifted the soaked tile, he saw a second layer that didn't belong to any repair. Someone had built a pocket up there. Every Wednesday, the same steel key tag left the housing office on a braided cord. It came back before lunch, sometimes damp, sometimes dusted with plaster. The paperwork treated leaks like weather. A tenant complained, a superintendent logged it. Someone signed for access, and a square stamp moved the problem from one folder to the next. This block had dozens of identical service closets. Each one held a shutoff valve, a fuse panel, and a narrow shelf where old bulbs collected. The routine was simple: sign out the closet keys, walk the stairwells, listen for the hiss of a radiator, and leave a note if a door needed to be forced. The superintendent had done it for years. He knew which apartments kept a saucepan under the sink and which ones kept towels at the baseboards. He also knew which residents never wanted him inside unless they were standing in the doorway, arms folded, watching the whole time. So the chalk mark on the valve bothered him. He didn't write that kind of mark. The plumbers he used didn't either. At the housing office, the clerk pulled the maintenance ledger and found what the men with clipboards asked for: a repeating entry that didn't belong in a plumbing book. Line test corridor ceiling. It appeared once a week, always on Wednesday, always signed with a name that wasn't on the building staff list. The cover story sat neatly on a separate work order. Telephone inspection, no letterhead, no contractor address. Just a carbon copy with a stamp and a place to sign for keys. The clerk had a habit of tracking signatures. Not for ethics, for inventory. Keys went missing, locks got changed, residents complained. If a key disappeared, it meant a full day with a locksmith and a hallway full of people asking why their doors wouldn't open. On the sign-out page, most names had a recognizable hand, round letters from the superintendent, tight slashes from the night watchman, big block printing from the janitor who wrote like he was carving it into stone. The Wednesday signature didn't match any of them. It was careful. It leaned slightly right. And each week it landed in the same line, as if the writer knew exactly where to put the pen. When the superintendent asked for the torn page, the clerk didn't answer right away. She slid the ledger aside and reached into the drawer where misfiled complaints ended up. Old noise reports. A missing bicycle claim. A note about a loose stair rail. Under those papers, she kept duplicates, carbon sheets pulled before they were bound. It was a quiet habit in an office where folders disappeared when someone higher up wanted them gone. The duplicate showed the missing Wednesday line. It also showed something else: the closet key tag number copied in the margin, and a second set of initials that weren't part of the form. Not a name, just two letters. The superintendent read them twice. Then, he asked for the key ring. He wanted to see whether any tag was newer than the others. In the hallway outside the office, the keys hung on nails driven into a wooden board. The superintendent lifted the ring and heard the same clink he'd heard on the stairs. One tag was bright. It had been cut from fresh metal. It wasn't from the locksmith. The edges were too clean. He put the ring back and didn't say what he saw. Instead, he asked a different question. Who had authority to order a telephone inspection inside a housing block? The clerk shrugged in the way people did when the answer was someone above us. She pointed to a phone extension list taped to the wall, smudged by fingerprints. There was a number for utilities, a number for police liaison, a number for security coordination written in pencil and never typed. The building's leaks kept coming, but the work orders changed shape. A pipe repair that used to list plumber now listed inspection. A ceiling patch that used to list materials now listed access required. Residents noticed the new language, not the reason. Doors were opened when they were told to open them. Closets were left unlocked when someone promised to relock them. A saucepan stayed under a drip because it was easier than arguing. By the end of the week, the superintendent made his own routine. He wrote down in his pocket notebook every Wednesday visit he could remember. He wrote down which stairwell, which closet, which apartment had been asked for quick access, and which one had been told to wait in the kitchen. He stopped fixing the leak above the third-floor light. He let the stain grow back into a ring. Next Wednesday, he planned to stand under that light and watch who came for the keys. But he wasn't alone. Wednesday came with a new sound in the stairwell. Not footsteps. A quick metal rattle like a keyring being tested against a lock. The superintendent positioned himself under the third-floor kitchen light before the office opened. He kept his hands in his coat pockets and watched the ceiling stain he had allowed to return. The saucepan was back under the drip, centered carefully, like someone had measured where the water should land. At 7:42 a.m., the housing office door opened, and a man he didn't recognize signed the ledger. He didn't pause to read the form. He wrote the same careful slanting name as the Wednesdays before, then lifted the keys from the nail without looking up. He carried no wrench, no bag of fittings. Just a flat brown case, the kind that could hold papers or a small instrument panel. The superintendent followed at a distance that looked accidental. He stopped to tie a shoe. He let another tenant pass. He kept the man in sight by listening for the clink of keys as he climbed. The man didn't go to a radiator closet. He went straight to the third-floor service door. He unlocked it fast, then he closed it behind him. That was the break. The routine used to include a hallway, a glance back, some visible pretense of work. The superintendent waited for the sound of a pipe wrench striking metal. Instead, he heard silence broken only by the steady tap of the drip into the saucepan. At 7:51 a.m., the service door opened again. The man stepped out, locked up, and walked down without wiping his shoes. A small smear of white sealant marked the edge of his sleeve cuff. When he reached the landing below, he paused at a window as if checking whether anyone had followed him. The superintendent didn't confront him. He went to the service door after the man was gone and tested the knob. Locked. He crouched, looked at the keyhole, and saw a fresh scratch across the brass like a tool had slipped. Back inside the third-floor apartment, he asked the tenant for permission to inspect the ceiling again. The tenant hesitated, then moved the saucepan aside and pointed upward with two fingers as if not wanting to touch the stain. The tile came down easier this time. Too easy. The corner that had resisted before now popped loose with a soft tear of adhesive. The metal tray was gone. The plastic tube was gone. In their place, a neat rectangular cut had been made into the gypsum board above the grid, then covered with a thin panel painted the same dull white as the ceiling. It was a patch that didn't match any maintenance standard in the building. He slid a screwdriver under the panel and lifted. Inside was the pocket he'd glimpsed the first time, now cleaned and squared off. A short run of cable entered from the hallway side, wrapped in cloth tape, then disappeared into a drilled hole that had been sealed with fresh compound. There was also a shallow bracket screwed into the wood cross piece. Something had been mounted there recently and removed fast. That closed one question and opened two more. The second system wasn't rumor. It was carpentry tape and drilled holes hidden above a public ceiling. He took the only picture he could without making it obvious. Not a camera. A cheap instant unit borrowed from the housing office for documenting flood damage. He snapped the pocket, the bracket marks, the taped cable run. Then he put everything back as close as he could, including the saucepan under the drip. At the housing office, he didn't mention the pocket to the clerk. He asked for the number written in pencil, the one listed for security coordination. He spoke like he was asking for help with vandalism. He described missing materials. Unauthorized access, a sealing patch that wasn't logged. The call didn't produce a name, it produced instructions. Bring the ledger, bring the photo, say nothing to the residents. That afternoon, two technicians arrived who did carry tools, but not for plumbing. They brought a compact receiver, a collapsible antenna, and a clipboard with blank forms that had no letterhead. They walked the third floor corridor slowly as if counting steps, pausing near the kitchen light and watching the needle on their meter. They didn't talk about spies. They didn't need to. The meter dipped and rose with each foot of distance, and when it rose at the same ceiling seam where the patch sat. One technician asked the superintendent a flat question: had anyone recently repaired the leak before it was reported? The superintendent thought of the chalk mark on the valve, the careful signature, the brown case. He answered the only honest way he could. Yes. Someone had been there first. The technicians didn't open the ceiling. Not yet. They taped a thin pencil mark on the corridor baseboard, easy to miss, easy to find later, and told him to keep the saucepan exactly where it was. Leave the drip. Leave the stain. Let Wednesday come again. As they packed the antenna, the clerk opened the ledger to the sign-out page and traced the careful slanted name with the tip of her pen. Then she turned the book over and found a new impression on the carbon backing. The carbon impression wasn't a name. It was pressure. When the clerk rubbed a pencil across the backing sheet, a faint second line appeared beneath the careful Wednesday signature, 2 letters, then a short string of digits written as if it belonged to the writer, not the form. It looked like a reference the man never meant to leave behind. The technicians treated it like a route marker. They copied it onto plain paper and folded it small. Then they asked for every sign-out page from the last 3 months. The pattern tightened fast. Every Wednesday, the same key tag. Every Wednesday, the same careful slant. Every Wednesday, a work order filed under the wrong category. And the entries weren't limited to the 3rd floor. They bounced between stairwells in a way that didn't match leaks or radiator complaints. One week, a closet near the elevator. Another week, a closet above the basement electrical room. When the superintendent traced the addresses on a floor plan, the path looked less like maintenance and more like coverage. A corridor here, a corner unit there. Always near an interior wall, where cables could be hidden without drilling through exterior brick. Over the next 6 weeks, the housing office did something it had never done for plumbing. It ran its own surveillance quietly in the shape of routine. The clerk stopped hanging the keys on the nail board. She kept them in a drawer and made people ask. She watched how they asked. She watched what they carried. She noted which hand they used to write. The superintendent stopped forgetting his notebook at home. He wrote down shoe scuffs, sleeve stains, and the kind of bag someone chose when they didn't want to look like they were carrying anything important. The technicians came and went in plain clothes. They didn't announce a case. They asked for access windows. They asked which tenants left for work early. They asked which doors stuck and which doors closed with a soft latch. On the 3rd floor, they measured the ceiling seam with a tape measure and pressed along it with 2 fingertips as if reading a hidden line through paint. They moved a step at a time with their receiver watching the needle. When it rose in a narrow band that tracked the corridor wall, not the apartment interior. That mattered. A listening device hidden over a single kitchen light would behave like a point. This behaved like a run. They asked for building plans. Not official blueprints with seals and signatures, just the practical sheets used by maintenance crews to find shutoffs and avoid drilling into live lines. The superintendent fetched them from a cabinet that smelled like damp paper. On the plan, the water line feeding the 3rd floor apartments should have turned left at the stairwell and dropped straight down to the basement riser. In the ceiling, the cable path they'd found ran right. That mismatch closed the question the superintendent couldn't stop circling. The leak hadn't happened in the spot it happened. It had been made to happen there because that ceiling seam sat above a route that allowed a second system to ride alongside the pipes. The technicians returned to the service closet and inspected the shutoff valve. The chalk mark was still visible, but now they looked for what sat beside it. The brass faceplate had tiny crescent scratches around the screw heads as if someone had removed it and put it back using a driver that didn't fit cleanly. They opened the closet panel and found a short section of newer pipe cleaner metal, newer solder, nested among older, duller joints. The repair was too neat for a building that handled emergencies with whatever was on hand. Then came the butt turn that made the leak stop being a leak. The newer pipe section wasn't replacing a burst. It was creating a controlled weakness, a coupling tightened just enough to hold pressure, but loose enough to sweat when the line warmed. It would drip slowly, predictably, and it would stop dripping if someone tightened it by a quarter turn. A leak you could turn on and off. The superintendent stared at the coupling like it was an insult. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. The technicians photographed it the way you photograph a footprint, close, flat, and without drama. They didn't fix it either. Not yet. Wednesday returned, and the careful slanted signature appeared again. At 7:38 a.m., the man with the brown case signed out the keys and didn't look at the clerk. The clerk didn't look at him. She slid the ledger forward and watched his wrist the way it hovered for a half beat before the pen touched paper, as if confirming the line. He left the office, and the superintendent followed him again, slower, this time letting 2 flights of stairs and a cigarette break create distance. A technician waited by the building's front entrance, pretending to read a posted notice about stairwell cleaning. The man didn't go straight to the 3rd floor. He entered the basement first. That was new. Basements were for coal storage pipes and locked cages. No tenant asked for telephone inspection down there. The superintendent watched the basement door close. He counted the seconds by the drip he could still hear upstairs in his head because that drip now had a purpose. At 7:49 a.m., the man emerged and crossed the courtyard toward the street. He didn't hurry. He walked like a person on a schedule that wasn't written down. Half a block away, he stopped at a public phone mounted inside a kiosk. He opened the brown case, not wide, just enough to remove something small. A card, a slip, an envelope. The superintendent couldn't see which. What he could see was the habit the man placed the case on his left knee, angled away from the street, then used his body to block the view of his hands. The technician with the receiver didn't approach the kiosk. He didn't need to. He stayed near a parked delivery van and watched his needle climb. The needle rose as the man lifted the handset. It rose again when he closed the case. Then it fell, and the man walked back toward the building as if the call never mattered. Back on the 3rd floor, the metal tray was still gone. The pocket was still empty, but the cable run was still there, and now the technicians understood why. The device could be removed quickly, but the path had been built to last. They widened their map. They pulled sign-out pages from other nearby blocks the same housing office serviced. Not all of them, and not officially. Just the ones where a clerk knew a clerk, and where a missing ledger page would be explained away as water damage. The same careful slant appeared twice more in 2 different buildings, both within a short walk of a main tram line. The same misfiled category appeared with it. Telephone inspection, tucked into pipes, or heating, always paired with a key tag number. The operation wasn't a single sealing. It was a method. At this point, the technician stopped treating the leak as a nuisance and started treating it as a timing window. A controlled drip created a predictable complaint. A predictable complaint created an access request. An access request created keys on a desk. Keys on a desk created a corridor, a closet, and 10 minutes alone. M2 wasn't theory now. It was logistics. Access versus consent, written in a ledger line. They added a second layer of verification. They ran their receiver sweep in each mapped building and recorded where the needle rose, not just that it rose. In 2 locations, the signal band matched the same corridor seam geometry as the 3rd floor. They didn't open ceilings in those buildings. Not yet. Opening too early would end the routine, and the routine was the trap. The superintendent wanted to tighten the coupling and end the drip. He said it out loud once in the housing office as if saying it might make it true. A technician answered with a simple correction. If you fix it now, you lose the schedule. So they did the opposite of what maintenance existed to do. They preserved the leak. Over the next week, the plan turned from observation to interference. They would let the careful signature appear one more time, but they would change what waited above the ceiling. They would change it without leaving fresh sealant on a sleeve cuff. They would change it without tearing another page from a ledger. They would also follow the signal beyond the building because a device that transmits has to land somewhere. The technician folded the carbon rub digits again and slipped them into his wallet like a receipt. Then he told the superintendent to be under the kitchen light before the keys left the drawer. The next Wednesday wasn't about watching. It was about touching the system without leaving fingerprints on it. The clerk changed the sign-out routine first. She didn't refuse the keys. She just made the request louder. She pulled the drawer open, slowly set the keyring on the desk, and asked for a second signature for audit, as if water damage had finally forced new rules. The careful slanted name appeared twice. Then she slid the ring forward, but not the same ring. The tag looked identical at a glance. Up close, one corner had been filed into a tiny flat edge the superintendent could feel with a thumbnail. If that tag showed up anywhere else, they'd know it wasn't an accident. At 7:36 a.m., the man with the brown case took the keys and left without looking at the notice board. He didn't ask where the leak was. He didn't ask which apartment complained. He walked like he already knew the ceiling seam by memory. The superintendent waited a full flight of stairs before following. A technician lingered in the courtyard near the trash bins, hands deep in his coat pockets, eyes on the building's basement door. This time, the man didn't go to the third floor. He went to the basement, unlocked the door, and disappeared inside. The superintendent didn't chase him down the steps. He stayed where he could see the basement entrance and the stairwell window at the same time. The leak above the kitchen light kept tapping in his head, steady as the keys on the ring. At 7:45 a.m., the basement door opened and the man stepped out. His brown case was still thin, still closed. But he adjusted his grip on it like something inside had shifted. He crossed the courtyard and headed toward the same kiosk phone half a block away. He opened the case on his knee, again shielding his hands with his shoulders. Only today, a second man arrived before he lifted the handset. No clipboard, no keys. Just a newspaper folded under one arm and a cigarette held unlit between two fingers. He stopped beside the kiosk, angled his body away from the street, and said something the superintendent couldn't hear. At 7:49 a.m., the brown case opened wider for the first time. A small envelope moved from one hand to the other. It was the kind you could mistake for rent money or ration coupons from 10 feet away. The second man didn't linger. He took the envelope and walked toward the tram stop without looking back. That exchange was enough to change the plan. Watching the ceiling seam wasn't going to identify who ordered the work. Following the money might. The superintendent returned to the building and went straight to the third floor. He asked the tenant for access again, not with a speech, but with a screwdriver in his hand and a towel over his shoulder, like he was finally going to fix the leak. Inside the ceiling pocket, the technicians had left a substitute. Not spy equipment. Not a trap that would scream its presence. Just a plain mounting bracket and a strip of soft wax pressed into the wood where a device would normally sit. If someone installed anything there, it would leave an impression. They also left the drip alone. The saucepan went back under the stain. The ring around the kitchen light stayed visible. When the superintendent stepped into the hallway, he noticed the key ring's clink had changed. The filed tag corner was gone. The man had swapped the keys. That closed the question the building had been living with since the first chalk mark. The visitor wasn't borrowing access. He was carrying his own version of it, replacing the office ring with a duplicate that would put them back in the dark. The clerk confirmed it when she checked the drawer. Their filed tag ring sat where it shouldn't have been returned early without a signature line indicating a return. The man had taken the real ring and brought back the decoy as if the exchange could be smoothed over later. That mistake created a new kind of evidence. A keyring is an object that travels. It touches desks, it touches pockets, it touches locks, and unlike ceiling cable runs, it had to pass through human hands. By afternoon, the technicians had the superintendent walk them through every lock the visitor could have opened that morning. Service closet, basement door, roof hatch, storage cages. They tested each with the returned ring. The file tag fit everything, so the decoy was functional, which meant the duplicate ring the man carried was functional too. That narrowed the suspect set to people who could copy keys without using the building locksmith. The next step didn't happen in the stairwell. It happened at a bank counter. Records later suggested the man with the careful signature made a cash deposit within hours of the Wednesday inspection using an account tied to a small contracting front that had no listed plumbing clients. It wasn't a fortune. It didn't have to be. It was consistent, and it arrived on the same weekly rhythm as the key sign-outs. E7 didn't prove espionage by itself. It proved payment. It proved routine compensation for access that wasn't supposed to exist. By evening, the technicians weren't debating whether to open the ceiling pocket. They were debating where the signal landed when the device went back in place and who would be waiting on the other end to hear it. The saucepan caught another drip, and the ring above the light widened by a finger's width. Next Wednesday, they planned to let the device return. They didn't stop the Wednesday visit. They made it easier. The housing office posted a fresh notice about pipe checks and temporary access, the kind residents ignored, because it sounded like maintenance catching up. The clerk kept the real keyring in her drawer. The decoy ring stayed on the nailboard exactly where the careful slanted signature expected it to be. The technicians positioned themselves in 3 places that didn't look coordinated, one in the stairwell shadow line, one in a delivery van near the kiosk phone, and one in a rented room across the courtyard with a view of the building's basement entrance. Nothing dramatic, just angles. At 7:34 a.m., the man with the brown case signed out the keys again. Same handwriting, same line, same calm. The clerk watched his pen pressure more than his face. He took the decoy ring. He didn't react to it. That alone told them he had stopped depending on the housing office for access. He went to the basement first like the week before. The technician in the rented room watched him unlock the door and disappear. The van technician extended the collapsible antenna and waited for the needle to rise. If the ceiling pocket was empty, there would be nothing to catch. If the device returned, the building would announce it in a language only the meter understood. At 7:47 a.m., the needle jumped. Not a broad rise like static, a narrow, repeatable peak that locked to the same band the technicians had mapped in the corridor seam. They recorded it flatly in their log frequency strength duration. Then they wrote down what else was happening. At the same moment, a basement door closed, a case shifted, and a man who carried no tools stayed out of sight for exactly the amount of time it took to mount something in a ceiling pocket. The superintendent was upstairs under the 3rd floor kitchen light, listening for the clink of keys in the corridor. The drip kept tapping into the saucepan, steady and unhelpful the way it had before anyone gave it meaning. When the man finally came up, he didn't enter the tenant's apartment. He didn't need to. He opened the service closet, reached into the cavity above the corridor ceiling, and worked by touch. The superintendent watched his elbow move in short, controlled arcs like someone tightening small screws not turning pipe fittings. Then the man closed the closet door and walked out as if he'd fixed nothing. That was when the second half of E6 mattered. The technicians had been building a timing chart for weeks, without calling it one key sign-out window, basement access window, kiosk phone window, signal window. Now, as the man headed toward the kiosk again, the van technician watched the same frequency spike reappear, not in the building, but down the street. The signal wasn't staying in the ceiling, it was hopping. The man reached the kiosk, opened the brown case on his knee, and lifted the handset. The needle rose again, clean and sharp, as if the call itself completed the circuit. The technician wrote the time beside the frequency line and circled it once. Correlation wasn't proof until it repeated, now it had. A block away near the tram line, the 3rd technician watched a different needle on a smaller receiver climb toward the same peak. He wasn't chasing a person. He was chasing the landing point. He followed the rise to a parked sedan with fogged windows and a small antenna wire disguised along the rear seam. No police lights, no confrontation, just an investigator's hand on a door handle and the decision to wait for the right moment. When the kiosk call ended, the signal fell. The man with the brown case walked back toward the building. He did not look at the sedan. He did not look at the van. He looked at the housing block like it was a safe place to disappear. He wasn't wrong until the building stopped being neutral. The technicians didn't move on the kiosk. They moved on the ceiling. With the tenant's permission obtained the same way it always was, keys access, and a quiet lie about repairs, they opened the kitchen light tile and the corridor seam patch within minutes of the man's return. They did it quickly, but not carelessly. They photographed the bracket, marks E1, the cloth-taped cable run, and the fresh screw heads that hadn't been there a week earlier. Then they lifted the device out. It was small, functional, designed to look like nothing at all. A compact transmitter tucked into a housing that could be mistaken for a junction box by anyone who wanted to keep believing it was plumbing. The decisive proof wasn't the object by itself. It was the match. The frequency signature they'd logged in the van matched the transmitter's output when they powered it through a controlled test lead. The signal spike in their notebook wasn't a guess anymore. It was a fingerprint. That closed the question of what was being done above the ceiling. It also narrowed who ordered it. Inside the transmitter housing, taped to the underside, was a thin strip of paper, folded twice, an installer's habit more than a spy's flourish. It didn't carry a government seal. It didn't need one. It carried the same 2 letters the clerk had found impressed on the carbon backing, followed by the same short digits. A reference code used twice by the same hand. The sedan was next. The investigator at the tram line waited for the receiver operator to return to the vehicle. When the man arrived, he didn't carry a brown case. He carried a newspaper and a cigarette he still didn't light. He opened the sedan door, reached under the passenger seat, and touched the receiver like it was something that had to be checked before it could be trusted. That was the moment they moved. Not with shouting, but with bodies blocking exits and hands asking for identification that didn't match the cover story. The receiver was still warm, the antenna lead ran cleanly to the dash, a log sheet sat in the glove box with times written in the same careful slant. Not a confession, not a speech. Just the same rhythm, recorded in two places. Back in the building, the superintendent returned the saucepan under the drip out of habit, then realized he didn't need it anymore. The coupling in the service closet could finally be tightened, and the ceiling stain could finally fade, but the access question didn't fade with it. Someone had needed keys. Someone had needed silence. And someone had turned a leak into permission. The technicians bagged the transmitter, copied the ledger pages they could, and told the clerk to go home early for the first time in months. But they still hadn't answered who exactly had been listening. In the days after the transmitter came out of the ceiling, the housing office stopped treating keys like office supplies. The clerk replaced the nail board with a locked metal box and a second ledger kept in a separate drawer. Each sign-out now required a reason written in plain words, not categories that could hide inside pipes. The superintendent finally tightened the coupling. The drip slowed, then stopped. The ring above the kitchen light dried into a dull stain that would need paint, not a saucepan. The technicians took the transmitter and the receiver from the sedan to a workbench room that wasn't in the building. Records suggest they didn't announce what it was to the tenants, and they didn't need to. The device's function was demonstrated the same way it had been proven in the field: a frequency log, a controlled power lead, and a needle that rose on command. The pipe leak was no longer a complaint. It was the entry point. The man with the careful, slanted handwriting didn't come back on Wednesday. Neither did the second man with the unlit cigarette. The kiosk phone stayed where it was, but the pattern around it collapsed. That absence became its own confirmation, because routine operations don't stop unless someone believes they've been seen. The consequences landed in small administrative steps first. A telephone inspection stamp disappeared from the housing office forms. A notice went up warning residents not to grant access without a named work order. The superintendent's notebook, once filled with radiator noises and broken locks, now carried a new kind of detail, which closet screws looked freshly turned, which ceiling tiles sat too snug in their frame. Over the next 8 months, investigators expanded the method outward. They compared ledgers from nearby blocks. They checked which stairwells had the same corridor seam rise on a receiver sweep. They looked for the same two-letter reference on carbon backings and in the margins of misfiled work orders. In more than one place, they found the same logic: a controlled fault in a system that forced permission and a pocket built above a ceiling that let equipment come and go without a contractor ever showing his face. What they believed about who benefited depended on which file you read. Some accounts point to domestic security targeting a specific apartment line. Others suggest the Foreign Service exploited maintenance access to place transmitters near a visitor's route. No public record needed to name it for the building to understand the practical result: someone had been inside, spaces that belonged to everyone and no one had been asked. The tenant under the kitchen light requested a transfer to another unit on a different floor. The request cited plumbing issues. It was granted quickly. The superintendent helped carry boxes up the stairs and watched the tenant pause at the doorway one last time, as if checking whether the ceiling line still held anything back. The clerk was reassigned to a different office across town. She didn't take anything personal with her, but she did take the habit: carbon copies, pulled early pages, kept where they wouldn't vanish. Years later, investigators would still be able to rebuild the weekly rhythm from her duplicates even after official ledgers developed missing sections explained as water damage. In the building itself, the most visible change wasn't a raid or an arrest. It was how people handled routine. A neighbor stopped offering spare keys to a friend just in case. A tenant stopped leaving the door ajar when stepping out to the stairwell. The superintendent stopped accepting unsigned inspections that arrived without tools. Access was no longer background noise. Months later, the kitchen light was repainted, but the key tag stayed filed flat in a drawer. After the drip, who holds the keys?